Today is Wednesday, April 29th, and this is VOA's International Edition. I'm Lori Lundin in Washington. Coming up, as U.S. coronavirus cases rise and the president looks to reopen for business, the top health chief warns it shouldn't be rushed.
It could be a rebound to get us right back in the same boat that we were in a few weeks ago.
Human Rights Watch is warning children could be the biggest victims of the pandemic. Also ahead, another group of international entertainers plan a big live stream concert this weekend. It's all on today's International Edition. COVID-19 cases in the U.S. topped 1 million on Tuesday, making up 1/3 of cases worldwide. More than 58,000 Americans have died from the highly contagious illness, and new projections show there will be more than 74,000 American coronavirus deaths by August. As President Trump continues to focus heavily on reopening the economy, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Director Dr. Anthony Fauci spoke to the Economic Club of Washington, D.C. Tuesday and said it must be done very carefully.
If we are unsuccessful or prematurely try to open up and we have additional outbreaks that are out of control, it could be much more than that. It could be a rebound to get us right back in the same boat that we were in a few weeks ago.
Fauci also said he has no doubt there will be more cases.
So it's not going to disappear from the planet, which means as we get into next season, in my mind, it's inevitable that we will have a return of the virus, or maybe it never even went away.
President Trump on Tuesday said the U.S. is considering having passengers coming in on international flights from coronavirus hotspots to be tested for the virus. Trump also took an executive action to order meat processing plants to stay open. The United Food and Commercial Workers International Union says 20 union workers have died from the virus and an estimated 6,500 are sick or have been exposed to the virus while working near someone who tested positive. As AP correspondent Sagar Magani reports, President Trump's order came amid concerns over closures and the nation's food supply.
Industry leaders have warned Americans could see chicken, pork, and other meat shortages on store shelves in days after workers at major facilities tested positive for the virus and some of the nation's biggest processing plants closed. South Dakota Senator Mike Rounds tells the AP things will get worse as people get worried.
And people start to do the same thing to the meat supplies as they did to toilet paper. You're going to see the shelves bare fairly quickly.
He'd asked the president to use the Defense Production Act to classify meat processing as critical infrastructure to keep plants open. The president agreed, but disputed there will be any shortages, saying the supply chain had simply hit a roadblock.
There's plenty of supply.
Sagar Magani, Washington.
The Republican-run Senate is returning to session next week as President Donald Trump accused the Democratic-led House of Representatives of not wanting to work. Joining us to talk about the decision not to return is VOA congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson. Catherine, wasn't the U.S. House of Representatives also expected to return next week?
Well, the U.S. House actually had a stumbling block happen Tuesday. They had expected to come back to Washington, D.C. for a full session of lawmaking next week. But House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer actually announced Tuesday that they would not be doing that after consultation with U.S. Capitol physicians. And that came as quite a surprise to reporters here in Washington, D.C., that abrupt schedule change, because they had just announced that they were indeed coming back. And the U.S. Senate is still set to come back on May 4th. So a little bit of disarray here as lawmakers try to scramble for a kind of in-between compromise where they're still working remotely and doing a lot of those committee reports, committee hearings that you would see when they're in town in Washington, D.C., they're just going to move all of that online.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, he wants the Senate to come back and work in person on Capitol Hill, but apparently that's not the case in the House with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. What is her reasoning? What is she saying?
Well, what's really interesting about the differing situations between the Senate and the House is that the leadership in both chambers actually consults with the same U.S. Capitol physician on the health and safety for lawmakers. So they're receiving the same advice on the pandemic from the same Capitol physician. Whatever that physician told Mitch McConnell made him feel as though he could bring senators back to town to work next week. Whatever Nancy Pelosi heard from that physician made her think that the situation was still too dangerous. And I think also a lot of the input from her rank and file members has some input here as well. Lots of members were saying that they did not feel safe flying back into town, gathering with people from all different parts of the country, mixing in large groups, and then flying back to their home districts next weekend. I mean, really, when you think about it, the U.S. House is a perfect situation for the spread of a virus. Nancy Pelosi made that determination that lawmakers were better off working remotely, continuing to do that work remotely as the House tries to find some interim solution when they need to vote on legislation.
Is there any reason why they would need to be there in person other than voting? Are they looking for ways to try to vote remotely?
They actually had a planned vote on April 23rd to change the House rules so that they could vote on legislation remotely. That vote was scrapped after House Republican leadership voiced concerns about changing the House rules. You know, the U.S. House of Representatives is a very tradition-bound institution. A lot of these procedures have been in place for decades and were in place well before there were any online video conferencing platforms that could help facilitate this. Of course, we know that we have this ability now. It's a matter of getting, the House leadership, who is in their older years, to come around to this idea of new forms of technology and operating in a new way. And I think what you've seen through the coronavirus pandemic is a realization that they really need to face up to this reality. They need to have an operating plan in place in case these types of things.
That's VOA congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson. Well, ready or not, Greece is opening back up, but it is not happening all at once as the government plans to lift coronavirus restrictions in phases, keeping a ban on religious services to contain new outbreaks of COVID-19. The plan has infuriated the Greek Orthodox Church, and it's now demanding preference over businesses like hair and nail salons. Anthea Karasava has the story from Athens.
The standoff comes as Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis announces a gradual easing of draconian lockdown measures imposed here since early March. Government officials tell VOA schools and small-sized businesses will be among the first to open next week. Church doors will also be unlocked, but only to allow followers to enter and pray on their own, not in large numbers and not for religious services. Country's Archbishop has sent a stern letter to the Prime Minister, pressing him to reconsider. But on Tuesday, the Church's spokesperson, the Metropolitan of Nafpaktos, Ierotheos, accused the government of staging what he called a coup against the country's religious authority. What do they really think the Church is, he asked in front of reporters Tuesday. Do they consider it like another supermarket or union or nail and hair salon? The Church, he says, has been a guiding force for the nation and part of Greek tradition for more than 200 years. It's unlikely the Prime Minister will back down from his plans, aides say. The country's senior council of prelates, meantime, is scheduling a crisis meeting later this week. It wants to see churches open across the nation soon, in order to hold belated Easter services in May, services it has suspended as part of nationwide efforts to contain the spread of the coronavirus. The controversy is fueling a debate in Greece on whether the state should reconsider its close ties with the Greek Orthodox Church. Commentator Nikos Vlavianos, known for his left-wing views, argues for a separation. He calls this type of intervention absurd, and he says it reminds the world that in the 21st century, church and state are not separated in Greece. About 90% of Greeks identify as Orthodox Christians, although it is unclear how many of them regularly attend church. The Orthodox Church is deeply intertwined with the society of Greece, predating the Greek state by some 1,500 years. Throughout the history, attempts to separate the two have met resistance, with many Greeks citing the Church's key role in preserving the Orthodox faith for during 400 years of Ottoman rule. Antika Rasava for VOA News, Athens.
The International Monetary Fund expects Africa's GDP to shrink by 1.6% in 2020, its worst result ever recorded. European Union country leaders held video talks on Tuesday to discuss debt relief for vulnerable nations on the continent in an effort to help them cope with the coronavirus. Africa is seen as particularly vulnerable to the pandemic as experts fear weak healthcare systems may not be able to stem the spread of the virus. Joining us for an update on the EU proposals is Paris-based reporter Catherine Field. Catherine, which countries did they focus on in their relief effort discussions?
The main focus for Europe really is the G5 Sahel. And the reason for that is that conflict and poverty in the G5 Sahel region is the main driver of migration to Europe. It creates instability in Europe. So that's where the focus is. Now, the decision by the EU was also there with the 5 Sahel leaders and representatives from the United Nations and the African Union Commission. The push for this debt relief has really been the realization that countries in that region and many other parts of Africa are now paying more money financing their foreign debt than they are on public health. And public health now is the big issue that's going to and has the possibility of creating more instability, particularly the coronavirus, when there are projections that there could be as many as 10 million cases of coronavirus in Africa within the next 3 to 6 months. So the realization that so much money is being paid just to service these debts at a time when African nations need that money to go into the healthcare is what's pushing the European Union to really pick up just the idea all countries have got to come together and just, if not a moratorium, then some way that Africa doesn't have to pay these huge interests and principles on their debt.
Africa, so far, we haven't seen very high numbers of COVID-19, but obviously we know the continent is very vulnerable for this pandemic, and it's probably just that it hasn't either reached the peak there or they just lack testing. Obviously, though, the effect of the lockdowns and given the uncertainty of what will happen with this pandemic and the vulnerability there, it makes sense.
It does indeed. And that was one of the reasons why Charles Michel, the head of the European Council, announced that there would be some 4.5 billion euros in financial aid, particularly to the G5 Sahel countries, to meet possible public health emergencies. So they are realizing that money has to flow and that something's got to be done. And when you look at some of the other funds that are going into it, we've already had the EU 2 years ago give 250 million euros in humanitarian aid to that region. So there is a realization that a lot has to be done or else it really is just going to get worse. But having said that, the European Union itself is in a difficult position because it's having to rework budgets now. They're going into a new budget term, the 2020 to 2027 budget term. They're still working out how much money they're going to have, how much money they can give. So they're having their own problems. They can't give the answers that the African partners would want. But the answer they can give, and that was the message that came, was that they do realize that there needs to be some sort of African debt relief. It does have to be an international approach, and there also needs to be an approach which brings in everything else that comes along with helping Africa, and that means helping restore the state in all these areas, helping development, helping to fight terrorism, and really to commit to helping the security and development of the whole region.
Catherine, I thought the G20 earlier in the month already vowed to freeze any debt repayments for the world's poorest nations, of course, many of which are in Africa.
Indeed, but it was just a postponement until 2022. And even then, it's not really enough. And when you just look at some of the figures of what African countries owe, let's just look at one figure we've got, which is $365 billion is what African countries owe in interest and principal payments. That is their international debt.
Paris-based journalist Catherine Field, thanks for being with us. Following at VOA, negotiations between the European Union and ex-member Britain over new trade arrangements next year are at an impasse, according to diplomats and officials at the EU bloc's headquarters in Brussels. Talks between EU leaders and Prime Minister Boris Johnson were renewed a week ago, but have apparently already hit snags. Britain is also on track to record one of the worst coronavirus death tolls in Europe. Research from Germany and Italy suggests that footballers and other athletes face a particular risk of the coronavirus infecting their lungs, raising major questions over attempts to restart professional soccer. The research, produced by Italian immunologists and lung specialists based at institutes in Berlin, Rome, and Verona, suggests that due to strenuous exercise, elite athletes are more likely to inhale virus particles and direct them to the lower areas of the lung. With military cemeteries and ceremonies off limits, Israelis went online Tuesday to mourn their war dead in annual remembrances held under the shadow of the coronavirus crisis. As on every Memorial Day, a siren to honor soldiers and Israeli civilians killed in Palestinian bombings and other attacks sounded in the morning. Stay with VOA for all the latest U.S. and world news.